නවපෑස් සබන් සහ ක්‍රීම් ජාත්‍යන්තර ළමා රෝග පිළිබඳ විශේෂඥයන් විසින් සායනිකව තහවුරු කරලා තියෙන්නේ.
In your headlines tonight, appropriation bill. Supplementary estimate of 695 billion rupees passed. Bailout package. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe says he's working to receive IMF funds by September. Says it is essential for bridging finance. Deteriorating stability. Parliamentarian M.A. Sumantiran says MPs failing parliamentary structure, deepening political instability. Island-wide TU action. CEB Engineers Union to withdraw from duties by midnight tonight, demanding not to amend CEB Act. All this and much more coming up tonight on First at 9. This Wednesday, the 8th of June 2022.
Lifebuoy shampoo chuti rupiah 70යි.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Joining you tonight with news from across Sri Lanka and around the world, I'm Indivari Amwantha. Sri Lanka's Prime Minister appealed to the International Monetary Fund to send its staff-level delegation as soon as possible so that a staff-level agreement could be finalized immediately. During a telephone conversation with the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe requested that the IMF visit to Sri Lanka be made at the earliest possible as negotiations on bridging finance are reliant on Sri Lanka and the IMF in concluding a staff-level agreement. The conversation came shortly after the Premier told Parliament in a special statement yesterday that the country needs at least $5 billion over the next 6 months to pay for essentials, including $3.3 billion for fuel imports. In Parliament today, he said that he is doing his utmost to obtain the IMF financing by September, the latest. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe had discussed the country's prevailing economic situation with Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, during a telephone call last evening. The Sri Lankan Premier informed the IMF chief of the steps taken by the government so far to resolve the economic crisis. Further, he has requested that the IMF staff-level delegation visit Sri Lanka at the earliest possible so that the staff-level agreement can be finalized, explaining that negotiations regarding bridging finance was reliant on Sri Lanka and the IMF concluding a staff-level agreement. In response, the IMF chief has expressed her willingness to support Sri Lanka in these difficult times. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe briefed Parliament today on his discussion with IMF's Kristalina Georgieva.
I spoke to the managing director and requested help to expedite this process because we need the bridging finance. To get bridging finance, we need the agreement with the IMF on both our arrangements and also in regard to the debt restructuring plan. Now that's something we are unfamiliar with. So we've got the two consultants. We've got to speed it up, and especially in regard to the private creditors who've taken the ISBs. So I am doing my best. I will do my best to push this forward and ensure that we can get finance by September the latest. So we have to work hard and we have to think anew.
In the meantime, former Minister of Finance, President's Counsel Ali Sabri said the first tranche from the IMF to Sri Lanka could possibly be obtained by August following successful talks with them.
අපි තාමත් මේ ඉක්මනින් IMF එක කරන ලද සාකච්ඡාවල ප්‍රතිඵලයක් හැටියට මම හිතනවා ඒක හුඟක් කාලයකට ඉස්සෙල්ලා කරන්න තිබුණේ අපි ණය ගෙවීම අත්හිටු IMF එක සහ ලෝක බැංකුවත් එක්ක කරපු සාකච්ඡා ඉතා හොඳින් කරගෙන යන්නට අපිට හැකියාව ලැබුණා. මූල්‍ය හා නීති උපදේශකවරු පත් කරලා තියෙනවා. CNC සමාගම සහ ලසාඩ් කියන ලෝක පූජිත ඉතාමත්ම හොඳ සමාගම් දෙකක් අපි තෝරගෙන තියෙනවා. මට ලැබිලා තියෙන ආරංචි හා විශ්වාසය අනුව මට හිතෙනවා මේ සියලු සාකච්ඡා සාර්ථක කරලා පළවෙනි ට්‍රාන්ච් එක අගෝස්තු මාසයේ විතර වෙනකොට අපිට ලැබීමේ ලොකු සම්භාවිතාවයක් තියෙනවා. මොකද IMF එකට විශාල ඕනකමක් තියෙනවා. ඔවුන්ගේ සමාජික රටක් හැටියට මේ රට කඩා වැටෙන්නට නොදී ආරක්ෂා කර ගැනීමේ වගකීම.
A supplementary estimate of 695 billion rupees for government expenditure was passed in Parliament this evening. The Committee on Public Finance, chaired by MP Anura Priyadarshana yesterday gave its approval to the supplementary estimate. Out of this estimate to 695 billion rupees, 395 billion is for recurrent expenditure, while the remaining 300 billion rupees is allocated for capital expenses. In Parliament today, the supplementary estimate of 695 billion rupees that was presented by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was taken up for debate until the evening. Further, it was passed this evening without a vote of the members. Out of the 695 billion estimate, 395 billion is for recurrent expenditure and the remaining 300 billion rupees allocated for capital expenses. 87 billion rupees will be spent on continuing the payment of the monthly allowance of 5,000 rupees given to public sector employees since January this year. Further, a sum of 40 billion rupees has been allotted to pay the monthly allowance for pensioners and 15 billion rupees for the 1,000 rupee allowance paid to Samurdhi recipients. 50 billion rupees is planned to be allocated to the Ceylon Electricity Board to settle payments to the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and 50 billion rupees for the fertilizer subsidies. The estimate sought to allocate 25 billion for the provision of food and other revenue shortfalls in institutions such as security forces, hospitals and prisons due to the soaring prices, and further 4.5 billion rupees recurrent expenditures and 21 billion rupees for loan interests.
දේශීය වශයෙන් කළ යුතු විශාල වැඩ කොටස් රාශියක් තියෙනවා. උදාහරණයක් හැටියට බලන්න අපි හඳුනාගෙන තියෙන සමහර ජාතික සම්පත් කියලා ශ්‍රී ලංකන් න්‍යායාලයින් එක කියනවා ඒක ජාතික සම්පතක්ද? ඒක ජාතික ආර්ථිකයේ පිළිකා කාරකයක්. ඒ වගේ පිළිකා කාරක එකක් නෙවෙයි 193ක් විතර තියෙනවා. දරා ගන්න බැරි සේවක සංඛ්‍යාවක්, දරා ගන්න බැරි ණය කන්දරාවක්. ඒ හින්දා මේවා හඳුනාගෙන ඒ අවශ්‍ය ආර්ථික ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ වහාම සිදු කළ යුතුයි. 1977 අපේ විවෘත ආර්ථිකය ආරම්භ කරනකොට ඉන්දියාවත්, චීනයවත්, කැම්බෝඩියාවත්, වියට්නාමයවත්, බංග්ලාදේශයවත් විවෘත කරලා තිබුණේ නැහැ. නමුත් අද අපිට තරඟ කරන්න සිද්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා. බංග්ලාදේශයට ඒ කාලේ මට මතකයි හෙන්රි කිසින්ජර් කියලා තිබුණා බාස්කට් කේස් එකක් කියලා. ඒ කියන්නේ මේක සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම විනාශ වෙලා යන රටක් කියලා. නමුත් අද වනකොට බංග්ලාදේශයේ විදේශ සංචිතය ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 50ක් දක්වා නැගිටලා තියෙනවා. එහෙනම් මම හිතනවා අපි මේ බය කරලා මිනිස්සුන්ව නැති කරලා ආත්ම ශක්තිය නැති කරලා මේ රට විනාශ වෙනවයි කියලා බය කරන එකට වඩා මේක අවස්ථාවක් කරගෙන අනිත් රටවල් වල කොහොමද මේකෙන් ප්‍රයෝජන ලබාගෙන තියෙන්නේ, මෙවැනි ව්‍යසන වලින් කොහොමද ඉදිරියට ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ කියන එක ආත්ම විශ්වාසය ගොඩනගාගෙන මේ අවස්ථාවෙන් ප්‍රයෝජනය අරගෙන රට නියම තැනට සෙට් කිරීම සඳහා ආර්ථිකමය වශයෙන් සහ අපනයනීය වශයෙන් පාදක වූ ආර්ථිකයක් ගොඩනැගීමට අවස්ථාවක් කරගන්නයි කියලා සියලු දෙනාටම ඉල්ලා සිටිමි. මම නිහඬ වෙනවා.
ආර්ථික අර්බුදය ඉස්සරහට දාලා දේශපාලන අර්බුදය වහගන්න හදන්න එපා කියන එකයි අපිට කියන්න ඕනේ. දැන් මේ වෙනකොට ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ තියෙන භයානකකම පෙන්නමින් අපි සියලු දෙනාටම යෝජනා කරන්නේ අපි දේශපාලන ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ, අපි දේශපාලනිකව මැදිහත් විය යුතු. ජනතාව ඉල්ලන මේ දේශපාලන සංස්කෘතිය වෙනස්කම අපි පැත්තකට දාලා දැන් සියලු දෙනාම මේ ආර්ථික ප්‍රශ්නයට විසඳීමට එකතු වෙමු කියන යෝජනාව තමයි දිගින් දිගටම එන්නේ. නමුත් අපි දන්නවා ආර්ථික ප්‍රශ්නයට විසඳුමක් තියෙන දේශපාලන අර්බුදය විසඳීම හරහා කියන එක මතක් කරමින් ආර්ථික අර්බුදය ඉස්සරහට දාලා රටට අවශ්‍ය වන ඒ දේශපාලන විසඳුම ගේන්න නැතුව ඉන්න එක නොකර ඉන්න කියන ඉල්ලීමත් සමග මම නිහඬ වෙනවා.
The main opposition Samagi Jana Balawegaya parliamentarian Partli Champika Ranawaka informed Parliament today that he will serve as an independent member. In a special statement prior to the parliamentary debate this morning, Partli Champika, however, said that he will not seek ministerial portfolios. While chairman of SLFP former President Maithripala Sirisena welcomed the move, reiterating calls for an all-party government, ITAC parliamentarian M.A. Sumantiran lamented recent developments in Parliament as leading to the deterioration of political stability due to the lack of parliamentary structure.
මේ අවස්ථාවේදී පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ ආණ්ඩු පක්ෂයට මෙන්න විපක්ෂයටද වෙනදාට වඩා වගකීම් සහගතව සහ ප්‍රායෝගිකව කටයුතු කරන්න සිදුව තිබෙනවා. මේ ස්වාධීනීමේ අරමුණ ඒ වෙනුවෙන් වඩා ප්‍රශස්ත ඉඩකඩක් වෙන් කර ගැනීමක් ලෙසයි මම සලකන්නේ. මේ ප්‍රවෘත්තියේ පළවීමත් සමගම ඇතැම් ජනමාධ්‍යවල හා සමාජ මාධ්‍යවල මා ආණ්ඩුවේ ඇමති ධූරයක් ගැනීමේ උවමනාවෙන් මේ සිදු කරන බව පවසා තිබෙනවා. ඒ අර්ථකථන වල කිසිම සත්‍යයක් නැහැ. මේ ආණ්ඩුවේ කිසිම ඇමතිකමක් දැරීමට මගේ අදහසක් නැහැ. මා කියන්නේ මේ ආණ්ඩුව හරයාත්මක වෙනස් විය යුතු බවයි. මේ ආණ්ඩුව වචනේ පරිසමාප්ත අර්ථයෙන්ම සර්වපාක්ෂික ආණ්ඩුවක් හා අන්තර්කාලීන ආණ්ඩුවක් විය යුතු බවයි. අද අපේ විසඳුම අගමැතිතුමා විසින් ඊයේ ප්‍රකාශ කළ පරිදි ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදල මූලික කරගත් එකක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වැරදි ගියොත් අපේ පරිභෝජනය සැලසුම් සහගත ලෙස සංකෝචනය කරගන්නා වූ ස්වදේශවාදී එකක් වෙන්නත් පුළුවන්. මේ මොන විකල්පය ගත්තත් ඒ ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්නට අවම දේශපාලන කොන්දේසියක් සපුරා ගත යුතුයි. ඒ කල හැක්කේ පොදු ආවම වැඩපිළිවෙලක් සහිත తాවකාලික සර්වපාක්ෂික හා අන්තර්කාලීන ආණ්ඩුවක් නිර්මාණය කර ගැනීමෙන්. දැන්ට පිහිටුවා තිබෙන ආණ්ඩුව එවැන්නක් නොවන බව මා ප්‍රකාශ කරන්න ඕනේ.
චම්පික රණවක ඇමතිතුමා ඉදිරිපත් කළ අදහස ගැන අපි ඉතාමත් සතුටු වෙනවා. අපි ශ්‍රී ලංකා නිදහස් පක්ෂය මීට මාස 3කට වැඩි කාලයක පටන් ගරු ජනාධිපති ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂ මැතිතුමා සමගත් අවස්ථා දෙකකදී පමණ සාකච්ඡා කළා සර්වපාක්ෂික ආණ්ඩුවක් සැදීම සම්බන්ධයෙන්. අපි ජාත්‍යන්තර සංවිධාන සමග සාකච්ඡා කළා. මේ සෑම ආයතනයකින්ම කිව්වේ සර්වපාක්ෂික ආණ්ඩුවක් හදනවා නම් ඒගොල්ලන් උදව් කරන්න සූදානම් කියලා. ඒ වගේම ඒ තුල මැතිවරණයක් පවත්වන කාල සීමාවක් සාකච්ඡා කළා තීන්දුව කළා. ඒ ප්‍රකාශයට පත් කරන්න ඒ අනුව ඒ ජාත්‍යන්තර සංවිධාන සියල්ලම සහයෝගය දෙනවා කිව්වා සර්වපාක්ෂික ආණ්ඩුවකට මේ රට අද වැටලා තිබෙන තත්ත්වෙන් ගොඩ ගන්න.
The person who is single-handedly responsible for this economic crisis is still the head of government. To deal with the economic crisis, the wrongdoer must be removed. You can't keep the wrongdoer, the one who is mostly responsible, in that chair and deal with the crisis. How can you do that? This parliament now consists of independent MPs. New fashion. Each one stands up and says, I'm independent. But our system is that of government and opposition. This parliamentary system is not one where you have independent MPs. So therefore, the president must definitely step down or he must be removed. The parliament also has lost its mandate. There must be an overhaul of this whole system, but before that, parliament also must be dissolved. It's anyway dissolved into independence. So at least formally you must dissolve it now. Until you set this right, you are not going to even begin to address the economic issue. Every institution has told this country, there must be political stability. How do you have political stability with this parliament of independent MPs? You have no stability at all.
And we have more news coming your way after this break.
Big 3.
Welcome back. The Ceylon Electricity Board Engineers Union has decided to withdraw from duties from midnight tonight. Speaking in this regard, CEB-EU Chairman Anil Ranjit Indira said that their trade union action is a protest against plans to amend the Ceylon Electricity Board Act.
The Ceylon Electricity Board Engineers Union has decided to withdraw from duties from midnight today in a bid to protest against plans to amend the Ceylon Electricity Board Act. Speaking at a media briefing today, Chairman of the Ceylon Electricity Board Engineers Union, Anil Ranjit Indira, said that this government is preparing to amend the CEB Act, which was earlier amended in 2013. He said that pursuant to the Act, the process of competitive bidding in electricity procurement from private sector assures that the general public receives electricity at the least cost. Indira also alleged that this proposed amendment, which is to be tabled in Parliament tomorrow, is an attempt to scratch the competitive bidding process. Accordingly, the engineers has decided to resort to trade union action to protest the government's move to amend the CEB Act. In response to this decision, Minister of Power and Energy Kanchana Wijesekara tweeted that he will not take CEB's request to increase tariff hikes to the cabinet since CEB does not assist the renewable energy generation plans. He said that CEB should allow renewable projects to proceed and reduce generation cost rather than increasing tariffs to pay their own salaries.
අපිට අද ඉන්ධන නැහැ. අපිට ගල් අඟුරු නැහැ. කිසිම රටක් අපිට මුදල් දෙන්නේ නැහැ ඒවට. අපිට පුළුවන් පෝර වලට ගන්න, බේත් වලට ගන්න. මේකෙන් දෙන්නේ ඉන්දියාව විතරයි. ඉන්දියාවේ ක්‍රෙඩිට් ලයින් වලින් තමයි අපි අරගන්නේ. දැන් අපිට දීලා තියෙන මුදල් ටික අවසාන වේගෙන එනවා. අපි ආපහු ඉන්දියාවක කතා කරනවා. ඉන්දියාවක කතා කරලා කියනවා විගහට මේක දෙන්න. අපිට විදුලි බලය ඕනේ. අපිට ඉන්ධන ඕනේ. ඒ නිසා මම එකක් කියන්න කැමතියි. අවවාද කරනවා. අපි මේ රටේ ගිහින් බ්ලැක් අවුට් එකක් ඇති කරොත් මට කියන්න එපා ඊට පස්සේ ගිහින් ඉන්දියාවේ මේවා ලබා ගන්න කියලා. මම එකක් කියන්න කැමතියි. මේ සංගම් හැම එක ප්‍රශ්න විසඳන්න පාරේ යන්න බ්ලැක් කාඩ් අල්ලන්න ඒක ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. බ්ලැක් අවුට් කරන්න එපා. බ්ලැක් අවුට් කරොත් ඊට පස්සේ අපිට වග කියන්න බෑ. ඉන්දියාව දෙයි කියලා. ඉන්දියාවටත් ඕනේ තෙල්. අපි දෙන එකට සමහර අය විරුද්ධයි ඉන්දියාවේ. ඇයි මෙයාට දෙන්න කියලා අහයි.
Colombo Fort Magistrate Thilina Gamage today issued a warrant for the arrest of MP Johnston Fernando. On the directives of the Attorney General, the parliamentarian was named as a suspect in the case filed over the incidents of violence on the 9th of May in Galface and Kolpiti. The probes into the attacks on protesters at Gota Gogama at Galface Green and the protesters near Temple Trees by a group of SLPP supporters are being handled by the Criminal Investigations Department. When the case was taken up today, Additional Solicitor General Ayesha Jinasena told court that the suspect is in hiding and absconding investigating officers. Accordingly, the Additional Solicitor General sought the court to issue a warrant for the arrest of the parliamentarian. Now, parliamentarian Milan Jayathilaka and 12 others who were arrested over the incidents of violence on the 9th of May have been granted bail. However, MP Sanat Nishantarada and 3 others have been further remanded until the 15th of June. These suspects, who were arrested in connection with the attacks on the 9th of May, anti-government protesters outside Temple Trees in Kolpiti and Gota Gogama site at Galface Green, were produced before court today. The Colombo Boers bounced back to record gains after 3 consecutive days of losses while registering its highest intraday gain in more than 2 weeks. Analysts say investors took positions and traded on index heavyweights. The main index started off on a solid footing and maintained its steep upward trajectory throughout the session. Markets subsequently managed to partly recoup earlier session losses and closed for the day at 7,773, gaining 142 points. The more liquid S&P SL20 index was up 74.61 to end trading at 2,529.09. However, turnover was recorded at 1-month low of 1 billion rupees as retailers decided to adopt a wait-and-see approach, seeking more clarity on the economic front. The energy sector contributed 21% to turnover, while food, beverage and tobacco and transportation sectors continued to dominate turnover with a joint contribution of 36%. Foreign investors, in the meantime, were net buyers while recording moderate participation. Meanwhile, at the T-bill auction held today, the total offered amount of 98 billion rupees was fully accepted and a high reception for 3-month maturities were reported. Accordingly, weighted average yields of 3 months, 6 month and 1 year T-bills declined to 21.91% and 22.89% and 23.13% respectively. Post-auction, with the emergence of buying interest, 3-month maturity traded at 21%, while both 6-month and 1 year maturities traded at 21.50%. Taking you to global stock markets, Asian stocks rose significantly due to the encouragement of Wall Street, but the growth fears the risk of stagnation that might be brought in by the Ukrainian war. In addition to the fallout from the pandemic, the Ukraine-Russian war stands as a major recession risk. Despite this, US stocks managed to stay afloat for a second straight day, which Asian stocks benefited largely from. MSCI's broadest index of Asia-Pacific shares outside Japan rose 0.9%, narrowing from morning gains but recouping most of its losses in the previous session. The benchmark Nikkei 225 index gained 1.04% or 230.34 points. Hong Kong's Hang Seng index rose 2.24%. On the mainland, the Shanghai Composite Index gained 0.68%, its highest close since April 6th as consumer firms extended their rally on hopes from a demand recovery on easing COVID-19 restrictions. Globally, European stocks slipped and Wall Street futures were in the red as worries that central bank tightening will stifle global growth weighed on markets. Nasdaq futures and S&P 500 were both down around 0.5%. The 10-year US Treasury yield held just above 3%, having fallen on Tuesday. Now, the World Bank slashed its global growth forecast by nearly a third to 2.9% for 2022, warning that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has compounded the damage from the COVID-19 pandemic and many countries now face recession. In its Global Economic Prospects report, World Bank warned that the outlook could still grow worse, saying that the war in Ukraine had magnified the slowdown in the global economy, which was now entering what could become a protracted period of feeble growth and elevated inflation. Addressing journalists at a news conference, World Bank President David Malpass said global growth would fall to 2.1% in 2022 and 1.5% in 2023, driving per capita growth close to zero if downside risks materialized. Malpass said global growth was being hampered by the war, fresh COVID lockdowns in China, supply chain disruptions and the rising risk of stagflation, a period of weak growth and high inflation last seen in the 1970s. The World Bank chief said in the foreword of the report that subdued growth will likely persist throughout the decade because of weak investment in most of the world. With inflation now running at multi-decade highs in many countries and supply expected to grow slowly, there is a risk that inflation will remain higher for longer, he said. According to the World Bank president, the pace of global growth is projected to slow by 2.7 percentage points during the period between 2021 and 2024, more than twice the deceleration seen between 1976 and 1979. The report warned that interest rate decreases required to control inflation at the end of the 1970s were so steep that they touched off a global recession in 1982 and a string of financial crises in emerging market and developing economies. Policymakers should work to coordinate aid for Ukraine, boost production of food and energy, and avoid export and import restrictions that could lead to further spikes in oil and food prices in order to reduce the risks. Efforts to step up debt relief, as some middle-income countries are potentially at risk, strengthening efforts to contain COVID, and speed the transition to a low-carbon economy are key, he said. Growth in advanced economies was projected to decelerate sharply to 2.6% in 2022 and 2.2% in 2023 after hitting 5.1% in 2021. US growth was seen dropping to 2.5% in 2022, down from 5.7% in 2021, with the Eurozone to see growth of 2.5% after 5.4%. Emerging market and developing economies were seen achieving growth of just 3.4% in 2022, down from 6.6% in 2021 and well below the annual average of 4.8% seen in 2011 to 2019. China's economy was seen expanding by just 4.3% in 2022 after growth of 8.1% in 2021. Foreign Minister Professor G.L. Peiris left to Singapore last night to participate in the Asia Security Summit. Minister Professor Peiris is also expected to participate in discussions with Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan. The Asia Security Summit will be held from the 10th to the 11th of June, where the minister will represent the President. Asia Security Summit will focus on issues of security, cooperation and challenges in the Asia-Pacific region, and Minister Professor Peiris will also be joining the Ministerial Roundtable. Adjourned to the Security Summit, the Foreign Minister is scheduled to have additional meetings with several other international officials, especially the Prime Minister of Japan, Deputy Prime Minister of the State of Qatar, and the US Secretary of Defense. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijiang said that Chinese banks have already reached out to Sri Lanka and expressed their readiness to find a proper way to handle mature debts owed by Sri Lanka. He also said that they hope that Sri Lanka will work with China in a similar spirit and work out a feasible solution expeditiously. Meanwhile, China also expressed their readiness to work with relevant countries and international financial institutions to continue to play a positive role in supporting Sri Lanka's response to current difficulties and efforts to ease debt burden and realize sustainable development. And that wraps up tonight's edition of First at 9 on AdaDerana 24. Good night.